Good evening, everyone. My name is Sadi Sindhu, and I'm the Executive Director of the University of Chicago Center for Effective Government, housed here at the Harris School of Public Policy. We're thrilled to celebrate the culmination of the Democracy Solutions Project, an innovative 18-month partnership between the Center for Effective Government and Chicago Public Media in the run-up to this 2024 election. Through stories, listening experiences, opinion pieces, and news, this collaboration took a solutions-oriented approach to reporting on the critical issues facing our democracy. The 18-month special project examined the current threats to our democracy, including barriers to voting, cynicism, misinformation, polarization, and more. This partnership between CEG and Chicago Public Media has served as an example of how universities and media organizations can work together, allowing the wealth of knowledge that exists in both spaces to help inform our public square. I want to thank Chicago Public Media, especially their leadership, Tracy Brown, Jennifer Coe, Melissa Bell, and Gilbert Bailone for making this collaboration possible. But mostly, I want to thank Ariel Van Cleve, who served as lead on this project. Ariel, this would not have happened without your leadership, so thank you. We're also grateful to the Pulitzer Center for their support for the Democracy Solutions Project, allowing this partnership to flourish. So what did we do? Over 18 months, through the Democracy Solutions Project, we shaped the conversation around challenges facing our democracy and how to solve them. We published op-eds from leading practitioners that engaged with the scholarship in CEG's Democracy Reform Primer Series to explore the promise of different reform initiatives. From ranked choice voting to reducing the number of political appointees, these op-eds offered practitioners on-the-ground perspectives on the potential impact of different reform policies. But the op-eds were only one part of the scope of this partnership. The amazing reporters at WBEZ and the Sun-Times produced nearly 80 pieces exploring pivotal issues facing our democracy. From political violence to ballot design, from redistricting to campaign finance, these journalists shed light on the challenges through a solutions-based lens. We also held public events, including the discussion this evening, opening conversations about timely issues in our democracy with experienced practitioners. So again, thank you to our partners at Chicago Public Media, and thank you to all of you who followed along over the last 18 months. On that note, it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. We're delighted to have Sasha-Ann Simons serve as our moderator for tonight's discussion. Sasha is the host of WBEZ's Reset and the recipient of numerous awards for her work, including a Dateline Award from the Society of Professional Journalists and a Radio Feature Award from the National Association of Black Journalists. Welcome, Sasha. Joining Sasha is our panel of experts. Amy Gardner is a national reporter for the Washington Post. She covers voting for the Post's democracy team. She is a member of the Post team that won the 2022 Pulitzer Prize for Public Service for coverage of the January 6th attack on the US Capitol. Amy is also a democracy fellow at the Center for Effective Government and deserves all the flowers, so yes, clap. Come on up, Amy. William Howell is a Sidney Stein Professor of American Politics at the University of Chicago, where he holds joint appointments in the Harris School of Public Policy, the College, and the Department of Political Science. He is also the founding director of the Center for Effective Government and a co-host of Not Another Politics podcast. Will.
All right.
Lynn Sweet is the Washington bureau chief of the Chicago Sun-Times. She's a former fellow at both Harvard and the University of Chicago's Institute of Politics. She's in the Northwestern University Medill Hall of Achievement and was named by Washingtonian Magazine as one of the Capital's 50 top journalists. Welcome, Lynn. Adav Noti is the executive director of the Campaign Legal Center. The nonpartisan Campaign Legal Center advances democracy through law at the federal, state, and local levels, fighting for every American's right to responsive government and a fair opportunity to participate and affect the democratic process. Prior to joining CLC, Adav served for more than 10 years in nonpartisan leadership capacities in the Office of General Counsel of the Federal Election Commission, and he served as a Special Assistant United States Attorney for the District of Columbia. Adav, welcome.
Thank you all so much for being here and inviting us all to share this wonderful, beautiful space with you. We are excited for the warm welcome, and it's a lot. It's hard to believe we are less than 2 weeks away, folks. Less than 2 weeks away from the 2024 presidential election. But here we are. You know, we've seen a wildly unprecedented time and an unconventional race. So I want to dive right into the questions. And before I do that, I do want to share a quick note with our lovely audience tonight. We're going to be taking your questions at the end of this panel discussion. Now, to submit your questions, you can find a QR code. It'll be inside of your program guide that was on your seat before you sat down. So look inside the book, you'll find a QR code. You can go ahead and submit whatever questions you have, and we'll get to them at the end of the discussion. I'll try to remind you again at some point. But let's dive in. Will, starting with you, I would love for you to give us a brief overview or your thoughts. How well do these presidential candidates, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, represent the positions and the priorities of the American people? What are we working with here?
Oh boy. Okay, so what are we working with? In some ways, it's pretty conventional. In some ways, and I actually think all the anxiety that I suspect we're all feeling in the run-up to the election, the challenge that we face is to be discerning as best we can. Not everything is on fire. Not everything is bad. But there are some things that are deeply troubling. And the challenge, I think, as we try to make our way forward is to be clear about what's going on. So some things that strike me as reasonably clear is that we have somebody on the Democratic Party who's to the left of the political spectrum, and we got somebody on the Republican side who's to the right on the political spectrum, and that is as it's always been. And many of the stakes that are being played out have to do with the reach of the regulatory state, what our taxes are going to be, these set of standard issues that are real stakes, that are conventional stakes. Okay, so in that sense, I think what we are observing now is what we have observed for a long time, but it's against a backdrop of increasing levels of polarization among political elites that are not mimicked by rising levels or equivalent levels of polarization among the mass electorate. So that's a feature of our politics, a contemporary feature of our politics that I think that we struggle to deal with, that is represented in our presidential election, they're represented in all the elections that we're facing, which is that the disagreement that we see among political elites is not the same as the levels of disagreement that we see among much of the electorate. In that sense, there's a schism of sort that we have to make sense of. One last thing, because we've got much to lift up, I'm just going to sort of tease some of these issues, is that to my mind, the talk about threats to democracy this go around are very real. And that when we think about the health and well-being of our democracy and the rule of law and the capacity of our political institutions to continue to solve public problems, what the future of the administrative state is, these things are on the ballot in ways that they haven't been in past elections, and they warrant a whole lot of scrutiny.
And we'll delve into each of those topics in this discussion. Lynn, I want to turn it to you next. I mean, we saw in July President Joe Biden, his last-minute withdrawal from the Democratic ticket, right? Some of us shocked, some of us were just waiting for the moment. What do you think that said about the resilience and adaptability of our political parties?
Thank you for the question. Let me just first say to everybody, thank you for having me, and it's always good to be home, and I do see some familiar faces in the audience, so I'm getting the U of C warmth here from everybody. So what happened in July showed that you can change candidates in midstream, and the system can endure and prevail. Whether it will survive, of course, is what William is talking about right now. And we are at a precipice. But the seamless transition from the president to the vice president should not have been remarkable or even surprising. except to, I think, people who were uninformed with exactly how the campaign finance system worked and the laws dealing with delegates. Also, just the enormity of what it would take to pass up a sitting vice president for no one in particular who was out there who could make an argument to not replace Biden on the ballot. So in terms of resiliency, it showed that the Democratic Party had built-in system safeguards and the outstanding laws dealing with federal election financing all work seamlessly to make that transition.
Yeah. And Amy, given the tumultuous nature of this election, let's talk about the media coverage, right? The thing that you and I do, and Lynn as well. I mean, how has our coverage influenced public perception and voter behavior? What are you seeing?
Well, I mean, that's a complicated question because on the one hand, I think that what we're seeing this year is a lot like what we saw in 2020, where the media, the mainstream media in particular, is covering what the candidates are saying. And that's exactly what you want to see, in my opinion. You know, we're not saying Donald Trump isn't fit for office. We're putting stories out. This is what Donald Trump said today. And this is what he said that was true or not true. Fact-checking in real time is an important aspect of covering this presidential race in particular and the last one.
And when things get particularly politically charged, what is our role and responsibility?
Right. The problem, though, is that because of the polarization and because of the vilification of the media by Trump and his allies over the last 8 years, facts matter less for some people. And so what we write is dismissed out of hand by half the country. And that's a real problem. And we don't know how to grapple with that yet. So I can write a story about something that actually happened that I know happened. New rules governing elections in Georgia, for instance. That's the kind of stuff that I write about. And I will get emails from people saying, fake news, you're a liar. And I just don't even know how to respond to that. And that's where we are on some level with our political discourse. And we're really trying to figure that out, to be honest.
And Adav, this is a little bit outside your world. Obviously, you're on the legal side of things, but I wonder what these conversations look like in your circles, just as far as media coverage and how it's impacting public perception of things.
Yeah, and thank you for the question. Thank you for the chance to be here today. I am not a media expert and hesitate to suggest how journalists should or shouldn't cover it, but certainly there is an interplay between the legal activity and the journalistic activity. We're seeing that now all over the country. There's all sorts of activity being conducted within the guise of the law, the filing of lawsuits, the litigating of cases that are intended, very clearly intended, to generate media attention. And some of these are not serious legal efforts. Many of them, they're legally frivolous, but they're not intended to win in court. They're intended to make a point. And I don't envy journalists who have to decide, how do you cover this? Do you cover this as a lawsuit where a case has been filed and a judge will rule on it? That's one option. Or do you cover it as what I think it is, which is a talking point intended for political purposes? It's very difficult.
Will, what do you think? Is the current primary system problematic or dysfunctional?
Oh, those are the two options?
Yes.
Right.
The only two options.
Well, they're trade-offs, right? The introduction of primaries, the growth of primaries was a reaction to a political system wherein a handful of largely insulated political elites who were not broadly representative of the American public were seen to be pulling the purse strings, and that it was seen as an opportunity to enhance democracy by rolling out a long series of primaries and caucuses that now are binding. And we've moved further and further down that road as the role of superdelegates, which have some autonomy in this process, have attenuated, and it's really about the votes that are cast now in the primary and the caucus season to determine an outcome. But then you get something like what we just saw in July, where you have a sitting president who was essentially unopposed through this entire process, who'd wrapped it up just weeks before a convention, is deposed. And I'll say, my own view of this, I don't know the extent to which this speaks to the, whether or not things are functional or dysfunctional, but I think there's a reckoning coming on that storyline. That the system held, there were rules that allowed us to move forward as a country, but how that happened, and I don't mean in a conspiratorial sense. I mean, how is it that we had somebody who ran unopposed for months and months? No Democrat was willing to step forward and say, I'm going to challenge this guy. And all at once, in the aftermath of a single debate, the dam breaks, and there's a sense that, well, of course he should go, and of course it should be the VP. And while it wasn't clear who the alternative was, there was real talent to tap in there. And there wasn't so much as a pause. We didn't even take a beat to say, well, where should the party go, with some open deliberation in the aftermath of months and months of a lack of deliberation. It was, we're going to, of course, stick with the standard bearer, who is Biden. That strikes me as requiring unpacking. We're not going to have that unpacking now in the lead up to the election, but there should be a look back, and it should be a look back by people who care about parties and think about how we want to move forward in selecting who the nominee should be.
Would ranked choice voting or other reforms produce more popular candidates?
So that's one argument that's out there. We have we'll pitch the Center for Effective Government. A thing that we do is we roll out these primers, and we talk about what we know about particular institutional reforms, one of which is ranked choice voting. We're not seeing it at the national level, but we've seen that in a number of states, which is a way that one of the arguments in favor of it isn't just more popular, but more centrist voters. And those reference the point I made earlier. The levels of polarization that we observe among elites is not matched by the relative moderation that we see among the electorate, and a way to recover a sense of alignment there might be through something like ranked choice voting.
Yeah. Lynn, let's talk about money. How have trends in campaign donations and fundraising shifted? Like, how do the candidates differ when it comes to the fundraising strategies? And what can future candidates glean from their tactics?
So let me take the last part of your question first, and that is what has happened in this election cannot just be replicated. It is, you had the phenomenon that once Biden dropped out, Harris had an army of small donors. In a story that I did with my colleague Lauren Fitzpatrick of the Sun-Times, we found that the Illinois trend followed the national. Biden had 25,000 small dollar donors in July. By August, Harris had 90,000. That spoke to a phenomenon. But here's the thing, big money is going to stay, and it is influential. And let me just be a little provocative. I don't think it will make a difference if you have ranked choice voting or not, because money will find its way to the object. You can't, taking money out of politics is a real different question than how we vote and if there should be a primary system or changed. The reason Harris caught on in this small dollar spigot opening up is because of these particular set of circumstances of injecting hope in a deflated Democratic electorate, thinking that Biden was going to just get beaten by Trump with without much of a fight put up. So people who otherwise aren't part of the money game, and most people are not. Let me ask you, just raise your hand, how many of you donate to a federal candidate sitting here? Okay, a smattering. How many of you donate to a state candidate? How many of you donated to the school board race that's coming up? Okay, almost none. And that perhaps is the most local and central example of democracy at work in our city here. So while we had a phenomenon with Harris, the millionaire donors are still using their money in the independent expenditures. In the super PACs in Illinois alone, you have some of the biggest donors in the country on the Republican and the Democratic side, who are major players in not only super PACs, but in political operations whose donors don't have to be disclosed. So I wish, we're not in a test tube. Big money still talks.
Yeah. Speaking of big money, Adav, this week Elon Musk, the world's richest man and a major Trump supporter, he's been handing out $1 million checks to swing state voters who share his political views. Now, it's made a lot of people wonder, is that even legal? What are your thoughts on what Musk is doing?
So no, it's not legal. Just to take the easy question first, no, it's not legal. There's a federal law that prohibits paying people to register to vote. And if you look at the terms of this giveaway, it requires somebody to either be a registered voter in one of these states, or if they're not registered, to register. It's not a very close call. That is unlawful. The Department of Justice just today sent a letter to that entity saying, if this is in fact what you're doing, that is unlawful. But put aside Elon Musk for a second, or broaden from Elon Musk for a second. The idea, and this goes to how money gets into the system, the idea that the richest person in the world could drop into a presidential race at this stage with tens of millions of dollars in just a matter of weeks to potentially influence what could be a very close election, that should be really troubling to everybody, right? That is not good for democracy, that one person or any small set of billionaires or corporations could do something like that. I mean, I'm pretty optimistic generally about the state of our democracy. Our campaign finance system, it's hard to find anything good to say about the current state of that. I mean, we'll talk more about potential reforms, but I think it's cumulative, fixing the way money comes into the system, along with structural reforms like ranked choice voting. If we can put a few of those together, there's no silver bullet, but cumulatively, they can make quite a difference.
Let's talk election security, Amy. Based on your reporting, I'm curious what the most significant challenges are facing election security in this country today.
Wow, that's a really big question. I mean, there's a couple of different ways to slice that. I mean, cybersecurity is probably at the top of the list, especially from foreign actors. I believe that there was an announcement today that a foreign country had attempted to hack into Georgia's election system, but had failed. And I should say, that happens every election cycle. I've heard election officials say for years, oh, we got pinged by something in Turkey or whatever. That happens, and we have a system now where our Homeland Security Department considers election infrastructure critical infrastructure, so that it's a part of the federal government's priority list of things to protect, and that's so there's a lot that happens there. That's good. But there are other ways to look at election security. I believe that the manner in which we all cast our ballots in the states is generally secure. I believe the machines are secure. I believe that the rhetoric about the hackability of machines or the capacity of machines to be programmed to switch your votes from one candidate to another are completely false. I think that this is going to be a secure and fair and free election. So that's category number 2 of security. And then I think I would say category 3 is the most worrisome, and that's actually safety, personal safety for election officials, for voters. There are several states this year that are requiring one individual in every single voting location to wear a panic button on a lanyard around their neck. There are states that are putting marshals out front of every voting location, or have trained law enforcement in their states, this happened in North Carolina, on how to respond quickly to an emergency at a polling location, but to not intimidate voters. That's a real balancing act, especially in voting rights states where there's a history of discrimination and disenfranchisement, particularly of minorities. There's a balancing act to be struck between protecting the safety and security of voters, election officials, at polling locations and not intimidating them. But election workers, election administrators are haggard, they're underpaid, they are threatened and harassed, they're accused of fraud, and they are worried about their safety. And so that's the part of this election that probably keeps me up at night more than the security of the result.
Yeah, I mean, Republicans often raise concerns, to your point there, about ineligible voters casting ballots or just dishonesty from election officials. So what I think I'm hearing you say is these concerns aren't real?
Fraud happens, mistakes happen. Fraud happens in vanishingly small numbers, is almost always caught. State election boards regularly hold public meetings to discuss the ways in which somebody illegally voted after their spouse passed away or turned in somebody else's mail ballot. I mean, you can look at the records and see that they're catching these people and they're prosecuting them, and they are tiny, tiny numbers. The conspiracy theories that emerged out of 2020 that millions of non-citizen residents of this country voted, no evidence to support that. That the Dominion voting machines switched millions or thousands of votes from Biden to Trump, no evidence to support that. That mail ballots are fraudulently deposited in drop boxes around the country by these mules, no evidence to support that. So yeah, I would say the answer is it's not true. And with the caveat that it happens, but it's trivial and it rarely can happen in a way that would affect an outcome because it's so rare for an outcome to be that narrow.
Go ahead, Will.
Can I ask a follow-up on this? There's the concern about our ability to pull off an election that's free and fair. There also is our ability to convince people to devote their time and labor to the work of election administration going forward. And so let's say and you've covered this a bit, like what the effect that these threats of violence and intimidation have had on the people who are doing this crucial work for the health and well-being of a democracy. Is it harder to attract these people? Are they more likely to step back? I mean, is this something we should be worried about going forward?
Yes, it's happening in real time. Since 2020, more than half of election officials who are in charge at the county level have either retired or quit. I was in Nevada last weekend traveling around the whole state, the rural part of the state, with the Secretary of State who runs elections in Nevada. I visited 4 election offices. 2 of the 4 top election administrators in those counties are planning to retire after this election cycle. One of them admitted to me that they struggle with substance abuse because of the pressure of the job and the harassment that they have been under. And then a third of those 4 counties, the current election administrator is on leave. Went on leave in the middle of the 2024 cycle after the primary because it was too much. And so there is a deputy who has been in the county for 5 months, and this is Washoe County, which is Reno, which is the 2nd largest county in the state and very important to the outcome. The person in charge, who seems like a very competent person, he's only been in Reno for 5 months. That's the kind of situation that's happening all over the country.
Plus, if I may jump in here, and this is the situation we're parked at this point in time, that even if every election official in these most contested areas were the veterans, you have a whole disinformation operation out there saying no matter what, if Trump loses, the election is rigged. Let that sink in. It's already happening.
Yeah.
I can't tell you exactly what it will be. Maybe not Dominion voting systems again, okay? But it's out there to have some kind of systematic challenge to the election almost no matter what the professionals deliver in terms of a correct count. That is frightening. That is a phenomenon that is happening in real time right now, and for which we know it will be difficult to deal with because we're already dealing in an election where people find it believable to want to believe things that are demonstrably not true to a candidate who says things that is not true, yet that untruthfulness does not have an impact on anyone in the audience. Let me just give you a quick local example. When Trump was in Chicago, by now it's 2 weeks ago at the Economic Club, at the Fairmont Hotel, he starts out his session that on the drive over, I saw closed steel mills and closed factories turn into senior homes. Audience, most of you are from Chicago. You know what's between the Trump Hotel and the Fairmont Hotel.
Not factories.
It's not factories. It's not steel mill, yet the moderator let that go. That should not have happened.
Right. Adav, I'm curious what's top of mind for you, just from that legal standpoint, as we talk about election security and the points that Lynn raises.
Well, it all ties in together. I mean, what we're seeing with these narratives, remember, these are not, most of the politicians who are generating these narratives about problems, supposed problems in the system, are very well aware that the system is in fact completely safe and completely secure, and these things aren't happening. They're not saying it because they're true or that they believe it. They're saying it for political gain. So, and it appears to succeed, at least in some segments of the voting population. So, in addition to the structural reforms that we need to change the incentives for politicians to do that, I mean, politicians say things for political gain. So the way to stop them from saying these untrue things is to make it a political liability, right? And that would not be that hard to do, especially if we're talking about sort of federal candidates. If we had leaders at the federal level, like congressional leaders, party leaders, who all were of the mind that we're going to fight hard, we're not going to be nice to each other, we're going to be super aggressive, but there are some lines we will not cross. We will not call all of American democracy into question. We will not lay the groundwork for attempted subversion or overthrow of election results. That is unacceptable, whether my side does it or your side does it. If we had people with that courage and were willing to speak up about it, that would change the incentive system for politicians to say those things. They would be marginalized in their party, and it wouldn't get them what it is currently getting them. So in addition to the other reforms that we need, we really need to disincentivize the politicians from saying these things that they know are false.
Can I add something too?
Sure.
Adding on to a couple of things that Lynn said in particular, it's not just anyone who's saying that the only way the Democrats can win is if they cheat. It's Donald Trump who is saying that. He is the one saying that. And so I just want to amplify that we know that if Kamala Harris wins this election, Trump will not accept the result and will attempt to change it, as he did 4 years ago. And so when I talk about there being a free and fair and secure election, I'm talking about all the way up to the point where we know what the actual counted and canvassed and certified result is.
Right.
I'm not talking about what happens after. I actually think that that's the scariest part of all of this, particularly if Trump loses. And my guess is that although we talked a little bit about the frivolity of some of the lawsuits that we've seen from the Republican side, or frivolousness, I do think that in the nature of those lawsuits is the roadmap and the breadcrumb trail of what they're trying to do.
Yeah.
A lot of the lawsuits have to do with eligibility of who's voting. And that, to me, is going to be the number one objective of Republicans if Trump loses, is to seek the disqualification of entire pools of voters and who they are going to claim are ineligible either because they're not citizens or they didn't provide voter ID or they didn't fill out the ballot envelope on their mail ballot properly. And because those are the topics that's been the subject of their lawsuits so far. And one of the things that we've seen that's different this year than 4 years ago is a whole mess of lawsuits much earlier on in the process. 4 years ago, they sued like demons after the fact, and all those suits got tossed. A lot of them got tossed before they even got heard, and that's an argument that you hear from Republicans. We didn't lose those suits. They never got considered. There is some truth to that, although if they had had any evidence, they would have been heard. They didn't have any evidence they didn't bring any evidence with them in their briefs. But the lesson for them was to file early and often this year and to say, and to use the evidence that their volunteer army that they claim that they're going to have fanned out across the country, gathering evidence of irregularities in polling locations around the country, will populate those lawsuits after the fact if they lose.
If I could just build on that, one of the things that Trump counts on is civic illiteracy and not knowing how the system works. One of the things that happens is you file a lawsuit, you do not automatically get to have that case heard. You have to have standing, and anyone who files a lawsuit, a civil lawsuit, is subject to a motion to dismiss. That is not special for Trump. It's anyone in here, in any court, state or federal. Trump goes around saying he never, to nullify the fact that no one filed a lawsuit that succeeded in any of the election claims, he said that doesn't count because they never heard my case. And if you don't know the system on the surface, it sounds right. This is the cleverness and the genius of how Trump communicates, because it depends on people not knowing how systems work, right. Which I don't blame people. Okay, everyone's got lives, and there's a lot of things we don't know. Gosh knows I don't know how to fix my car, okay? And everybody has their specialty. The people up here have this knowledge base of something that most people don't go to bed at night thinking about how elections work, which of course I do because I'm into it. And I bet we all could stay up all night talking about comparative voting systems. But when we're looking at what's happening now and laying the predicate to call fouls on a fair game, you see the danger that we're in right now with the Trump organization writ large, smarter this time because they are trying to fix all the flaws of the last election.
Yeah. A couple of legal questions here for Adav and then Will. Adav, how have recent Supreme Court rulings influenced the trajectory of this 2024 presidential race, specifically the July ruling on presidential immunity? Yeah. So talk about that and what it tells us about the role of the judiciary in our electoral process.
Yeah, so unfortunately, the current Supreme Court, when it comes to any issue of democracy generally, given its track record, really can't be trusted on voting rights and gerrymandering, campaign finance, bribery, ethics, presidential immunity. The court pretty much always, this current court pretty much always comes out the wrong way. But two huge caveats to that. One, there is an exception to that, which is the 2020 election. There was intense pressure on the court, incredible pressure on the court in 2020 to do its part to subvert the election results there. And the court didn't do that. In fact, didn't even get close, didn't even take the cases that could have led to that, much less take them and rule in favor of election subversion. So I think there are, of the 9 justices, there are probably 3 who would vote to subvert an election. There might be 4, maybe. There are not 5, there's not 6. So that's caveat number 1. Caveat number 2 is the legal framework, particularly around presidential elections, is very different now than it was in 2020. Most of the subversion efforts in 2020 were hooked legally on the federal laws that govern how electoral votes are cast and counted. It's a very old law from the 1800s, hadn't been updated in forever. In 2022, a very large bipartisan majority of Congress overhauled that law completely, modernized it, and took off the table almost everything that was tried in 2020 to get to the Supreme Court. That includes, most obviously, what happened on January 6th and congressional procedures, but even before that, at the state level, efforts to overturn the results there. Those are all gone because of those changes in federal law. And that's why, tying it all together, what we're seeing, the groundwork being laid for with these narratives about ineligible voters, and I agree we're going to see precinct level challenges, is because federal subversion is now much more difficult than it was. Statewide subversion is much more difficult. And so what we're seeing is what's left, which is the focus on the county level. But it didn't work in 2020 when the framework was much looser. Supreme Court didn't go along. Things have been tightened up since then. And I think we can be fairly confident that although the other side is, the folks subverting elections have had 4 years to prepare.
Yeah.
So have the folks defending elections. And I think, and we're part of that, I'm part of that group, and I think we're ready for it.
So, Will, considering the immunity offered to the president and threats of reprisals that Donald Trump has made at political rivals, what could a second Trump administration look like in practice?
So there's so many things that we can grab hold of.
I
Let's
know.
linger on this point about the immunity decision that was handed down, because I think when we think about the exercise of presidential power, now we're shifting away from elections and into the world of governance. It's really important to think about how limits are set on presidential power. Where are checks established? And the way generally to think about presidential power is that they're set by the adjoining branches of government, first and foremost. Our system is not premised on the notion that presidents with all of their virtue are going to exercise self-restraint. We need a system in which there are robust legislative and judicial checks on presidential power. Structurally, the courts have a very hard time checking presidential power, quite apart from the composition of the Supreme Court. Structurally, they depend upon the president because they lack powers of enforcement. And so this crucial dependence, when you think about the relationship between the judiciary and the executive branch, leads the checks that one might want a court to put on presidential power to be wanting. I think point number 1. Point number 2 is that we see through delays again and again a real failure of the courts to simply keep pace with gross violations of executive authority. Mm-hmm. Just the delays that carry out makes it hard to keep a president checked. There also are all kinds of ways that the president can politicize the judiciary. When you think about the limits on presidential power vis-a-vis the Justice Department, most of those limits are established through norms. They're not established through hard and fast rules. And those norms you can blow through if you have autocratic ambitions. So these are just structural features that we have in our politics that we've been living with for a long time. And then you have something like this immunity decision that was handed down in the fall that says, through blinkering lights, hey, as long as a president can meaningfully claim to be exercising something that constitutes their official duties, we're not going to get in the way. It's this great invitation for future presidents with autocratic ambitions to say, all right, the courts are effectively out of the way. And then you look over at Congress and you say, how are they going to check me?
Yeah.
And the answer is not so well.
Should we be worried?
Yeah, we should be worried.
Can I throw something out there? I had an interview a week or so ago with a retired 4-star Army general, and it was really alarming. Probably the most alarming interview I've done this year, which is saying a lot. And he said that there's a whole conversation going on inside the military leadership right now about this immunity decision, because imagine this scenario. President Trump is president again, and there's a riot or a protest or something, and a governor declines to call out the National Guard in his or her state, but Trump overrides that decision and says, no, we're calling out the National Guard, which is not really in his authority, but he can do whatever he wants because it's carrying out the duties of the office. But what happens to the military leaders who are beneath him, who are ordered to carry out those orders and who do not have that immunity? And it's this huge discussion of concern among our military leadership right now is what happens to the people and the institutions underneath the Oval Office who are expected to carry out potentially illegal acts. That's a very real scenario that people are talking about right now if he's elected.
And will Project 2025, that outlines a radical political agenda. How would Project 2025, Schedule F, and other attacks on the administrative state, how would they affect the ability of the government to deliver key services to the American people?
So Project 2025 is it's a massive document that
Have you read
covers
it?
all kinds of policy domains. What's that?
I said, have you read it?
Yeah, very. So the point that, the thing that you're pointing to is the thing that concerns me greatly when we think about the health and well-being of our democracy, which is the massive, massive politicization of the administrative state. Right now, we as a country are a huge outlier relative to other industrialized democracies in terms of the number of political appointees that the head of state makes. Their political appointees do good work, right? We believe in political appointees. They offer a measure of oversight and accountability, small d democratic accountability that's really important. There also are, if you politicize too deeply within a particular agency, and if you deeply politicize certain kinds of agencies, it can corrode the functioning of the agency. There's a lot of work that shows that leads to the underperformance of the agency. We are a huge outlier when we have a few thousand appointees nationwide that the president makes. But Project 2025 is off. Their initial move is to increase that number to north of 50,000 appointees, and to say anybody that has any policy-making authority sitting within an agency or department henceforth is going to serve at the discretion of the president. This will have profound impact on the ability of the administrative state to function and to deliver on their legal mandates. And it will be profoundly corrosive. And so this raises deep questions about where the administrative state sits in our notions of what a healthy democracy looks like. To my mind, you can't fathom a healthy, well-functioning democracy without having a government that can not just write laws, but implement laws that attend to the wishes and wants of a populace. And so this attack on the administrative state is itself an attack, in my view, on democracy itself. And it should sell, there are a lot of alarm bells that should be ringing.
Wasn't there also a court decision that discounts the expertise of the agencies over the opinion of federal judges, so that's another way that has undermined that sort of professional class of people running our agencies? I don't know the details of it, but I'm getting a nod from someone who knows. So
there is another way that, if I may add, that gets around even that. And this is something Trump tried to do and probably will again, to get around all that technicality. A technique that will probably be used is just moving agencies out of Washington, which can accomplish through the, I don't know, is it the front door or the back door? It can accomplish what you're talking about here without perhaps having to challenge the laws dealing with professional civil servants, because the reality is that if you just move all the agencies to other states, most of the experts you will lose a lot of the brain power, experience, and expertise of the people who work in these agencies now. And this is something that it was tried. I can't remember what agency started, and there was some parts of the Interior Department, I think, were moved. But one of the things that Trump gravitates to are things he could do without permission of Congress. And keep an eye on this. You may wonder, why is there so much talk about tariffs? Well, one of the reasons is a president can impose a tariff. You don't have to go to Congress, because once you start up with things going to Congress, even Trump could not necessarily prevail, especially if the Dems hold one chamber. But doing things like moving agencies, you still need Congress, but it is the cloak of respectability over really is an effort to undermine the administrative system.
Time now to turn to our lovely audience and hear from some of you. Thank you so much for submitting your questions today. So our first one, I'm going to put you back in the hot seat, Adav. So this question is, what is the path to reforming outdated and inequitable electoral rules when a typical voter's most pressing issue tends to be kitchen table? How do you get people excited about electoral reforms?
Oh, well, I think it's two questions. What's the path to it and getting people excited about it? I mean, I think...
I'm excited.
Yeah, me too. You need to sell it a little more broadly.
Thanks, baby.
The path is there. The ideas are there. There is plenty of fodder for reform when the moment comes where it is feasible to enact reform, ideally at the federal level. And those look like a range of things, including the ones we've talked about today: ranked choice voting, public financing of elections, things that give voices back to the voters and make the office holders responsive to those voters rather than to donors or corporations or others. No one thing is going to fix the entire system, but together it can make a demonstrable difference. So the ideas are there. The question, how do we make them happen? The voters need to say, we are not going to tolerate the sorts of candidates that we're seeing now who want to make the system worse rather than better, right? We saw some of that in 2022. Again, I'm more optimistic about this than some. If you look at 2022, there were a range of candidates who ran for offices all around the country who were very extreme on the other side of this. Anti-democracy, openly pro-authoritarianism. If we don't win the election, we'll just change the results. Almost all of those candidates were defeated, even in states where other politically similar candidates who didn't espouse those views won. This happened all across the country in 2022. If that happens again this year, and maybe it'll take another cycle or two, and politicians act for political gain, there should be a realization that there actually is real interest in the voting public in making the system better rather than worse. And that's where we need to get.
Thank you. Let's hear from both you, Amy, and you, Lynn, on this next one. What lessons do you think media professionals have learned, if any, over the last 10 years in how to cover Trump? You first, Lynn.
I don't think we've learned enough lessons. I think there's a new term that came about this cycle. I don't know who invented it. Sane washing. Are you all familiar with that term?
Say it one more time.
Sane washing.
Sane washing.
S-A-N-E, then washing. It is treating Trump as a normal, what Trump says, and normalizing it instead of saying it for what it was. And one of the latest examples is how the media grappled with covering the comments that Trump made a few days ago about Arnold Palmer's And
This is a family
Lynn wrote
show.
a great piece
well, I
on
don't
that
know who might be
in the
watching this,
Sun-Times.
but I think you can't say, now what I just did deliberately was sane washing for you by not using the word. He made a reference to Arnold Palmer's penis size. So if you present the story like that and have a headline that says this is highly irregular, to do it. I understand that President Obama at the convention also made a joke about the same thing when he went like that, but it was in a different context, and it wasn't about a third party, and it wasn't about what somebody saw in a locker room, which goes beyond any norm of what you would expect the leader of the free world to be talking about at a campaign rally. And one of the things you have is the treating too often of this campaign still as here's a story on Harris and here's a story on Trump and boom, 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 as if this were all on the level, and it's not. I wish we were more advanced, but the media also has done a terrific job of fact-checking. It doesn't seem to matter, though, in the way that I would have hoped 10 years ago. But I think that the origin of this was when the media totally laughed off the Trump talk about Barack Obama not being a native-born citizen of the United States, demonstrably not true, yet outlet after outlet let Trump parade through it, tell his lie, never challenged, that he had this army of detectives out there and he's coming up with stuff. And at a certain point, no one said, you don't have it, it's not true. And I think that's the origin story of a lot of the issues that we're grappling with today. And the media also, back at the time, should have done a much better job of covering Trump's businesses. The New York Times, which in essence was just a hometown paper for a presidential candidate, came very late to that game. Now, as the years passed, did they do a terrific job? Sure. But when the time was right for them to do something with a man they well knew in a city they knew best, they did not do what I think even they should have done at the right time. And so therefore, it is still a challenge as we speak to deal with even a Trump rally where every rally has things that he says that are not true.
Right. So Lynn thinks we've learned nothing. You, Amy.
I think Lynn made a lot of really important points. I would add that one thing that we've learned is that we should actually believe what he says. That's another aspect of Trump 2016, when the country was just sort of getting introduced to him as a candidate, was, oh, he doesn't really mean that. He's not really going to do that. And time has told us that he does mean it. He does mean what he says. He typically does do what he's going to say, or is going to try to do what he says he wants to do. And I think that's a really important point, because I get this a lot in my job. People accuse me and my news organization, the Washington Post, of characterizing Trump as an existential threat to our democracy. And they say it with a snarky tone of voice, like you guys all have Trump derangement syndrome. That's another thing I hear all the time. And in fact, what we're doing is simply reporting what he's saying. And we're not perfect, but I do think that the Post, going back to 2016, did a really good job of actually simply documenting what Trump was saying. One of my colleagues, Jenna Johnson, was on the campaign trail in 2016, and she would write these outtakes after his rallies that just quoted him. Big, long stretches of quote and description of what he was saying, and it was just documentary.
Unedited.
Yeah, I mean, it was written, it was beautiful, but it was just telling the reader what this guy was saying. And so I would push back a little bit on the idea that we haven't learned anything, because I think that many of us have learned that he's proven again and again that he means what he says. And I also think, while the sane washing is real, it's absolutely real, and I think we might be guilty of it sometimes at my outlet, but I think we're really good at simply saying in his words what he's saying, and I think that's the most important way we can hold him accountable.
Will, a question for you. Many voters express a dissatisfaction with the two-party system. How do we have parties that better represent Americans? Is a thriving multi-party system possible here in the US?
There's a push for this. There's this notion that if we go to a multi-party system, that will reduce the levels of polarization that we observe. To my mind, it will introduce new challenges. You will have people whose preferences can more cleanly map onto a single party. But the challenges that follow have to do with governing, which is just because you've elected a set of people that then need to come together, and what will coalition governments look like in a legislature, and there'll be new challenges that are put forward. I do want to read one thing into the record, which is about Trump, and I think we need to recognize that he appeals to a lot of people. And that it isn't just about reacting. I mean, the nation's response is not just one of horror and outrage, and you can't believe that he's doing these awful
he's
things.
got followers.
For a lot of people, they look at him and they say, thank God, here's somebody who is not playing by the rules, who's pushing back against a system that they see as being discredited, that has failed them for a long period of time, and what we see as the violations of the norm that should be punished and invite some kind of sanction is, for them, a testament to his outsider status and his willingness to push back against a system that has failed them.
There are a lot of people that feel that they'll be better off financially with a Trump presidency.
There's this too. I mean, but they like the policies that he's pulling forward, but they also like the text that's being put out there.
They like the Arnold Palmer story.
They like yes.
Yeah.
It's thank God we have somebody who is not going
And all
to
the others
just
like
read from the script.
Yeah.
And so that's a real thing. If you sit on the left of the political spectrum, it won't do to just say it's outrage all the way through. I think you need to find ways to recognize the legitimate concerns that significant portions of the public feels about this political system that they see as having failed them.
That's so important because there's nothing like, I understand the impulse to stick it to that establishment. But the thing that is so hard as a journalist is to understand that in the wake of sticking to it in ways that I think, I understand that sentiment, but the way Trump is sticking it is by telling things that aren't true. So that's where we're grappling with. If there is a way of accomplishing that same thing, of dealing in a very thoughtful and respectful way of the grievances that people have, but doing it in a way wielding things that are true instead of making up stuff to do it, that is the hardest thing that we're grappling with here. Yeah. It's, you know, if this were a baseball game, you can't pretend a foul ball is a fair ball. No one would go along with it. But yet in this political campaign, and to follow what you're saying and maybe use a good thing here, Trump is kind of harnessing this reasonable sentiment of not liking the system and feeling it doesn't serve you, but he's able to do it by saying things that would be outside, you know, it's not a fair ball, it's a foul ball, and that's why he's able to be as successful as he is in doing it, and that's what just is very tough to deal with right now.
Now, as we wrap, I'll sort of give you the last word here, Adav, and I know that you've sort of sprinkled some throughout your conversation tonight, but just talk about the electoral reforms that you believe are necessary to ensure a more stable and predictable democratic process in the future.
Yeah, the background here is that for 200 years of American history, most of the fights about our electoral system were like on the front end of elections. They were election day and earlier. It was about who was going to be able to vote, who was going to be able to register to vote, how they were going to cast their votes, right? And that's where all the fights were, and that's where the laws were built up and the jurisprudence built up and the protections. And there was very little attention to what happened after Election Day. because, I mean, rightly so, because in the end you should count the votes and whoever wins, wins. And 2020 changed all that. And after 2020, when we started looking at what do we need to make the system more secure, right, it turned out that most of that framework on the back end of how do we turn these cast votes into like actual results, nobody paid attention to that for forever, for 100 years or more in most jurisdictions, because they didn't have to. So in addition to structural reforms to make the system work better, to protect it, right, what we need to do is more of what Congress did at the federal level a couple of years ago, and a few states have done this year. Arizona, Michigan, Nevada, and some others did this sort of similar look at their codes and see what do we need to do to protect from election sabotage and election subversion. We need that across the country.
And I know you're wrapping up, but may I just say something quickly? And I want to thank everyone here being tonight, but one of the reasons that WBEZ and the Sun-Times can be here is that we are supported by our community. And what I hope you do is understand that we need you, and we're here for you. We don't have a paywall. If you please go to the website of WBEZ and Sun-Times, a little hassle sometimes, but you can read us for free. And we have a terrific school board voter guide that's accessible, that is you could access it at the WBEZ site or the Sun-Times site.
In English and Spanish.
Thank you. And it's important because we can't solve all the big problems right now in a forum like this, but we can look at our own Chicago community as a laboratory of how government works. One of the great experiments going on right now that maybe the students of Professor Howell will be studying is how the Chicago schools are governed. This is a test of governance, government and politics, especially in the context of the times we're in. So one of the things that BEZ and the Sun-Times has is a very robust, experienced, savvy, sophisticated education team, and let us help you and you help us, please, by going to this. We want to communicate you through our main websites. We have newsletters, we have text messages, we're doing more reels. So we want to communicate with you. WBEZ website and the Sun-Times, please sign up and use what we're here for and participate at least in looking, if nothing else, at our school voter guide for those of you from Chicago, because there's a lot to absorb and not a lot of time left to do it if you have not voted yet.
Well, breaking news, speaking of time, I've been given another 10 minutes, so we can keep
So
going.
can I?
Hey,
So can I ask everyone to pay a lot of money for a Washington Post subscription?
no. But while you're talking there, Amy, let's go back to our audience questions, because there are plenty.
Now this was like now after my commercial, back to regular programming.
I was like, I'll just let her keep going, because I work there too. Shameless plug. But Amy, what does outreach look like to the people who believe that our voting systems are compromised?
Oh gosh, we talked a little bit about this earlier today. I was speaking with somebody at a lunch event today who feels really hopeless that you can't reach all of those people because their positions are based in misinformation. Mm-hmm. And we haven't even talked about misinformation tonight, have we? No. There's so much misinformation out there, and I mean, I do respond to people who email me unless they're really, really rude and profane. And sometimes I get through, and they're often surprised that I'm a human being who wrote back politely, which is good. So, I'm doing my part for civil discourse. But I think there is a vast majority out there who they're tribal and they only get their information from their side of the aisle, and it doesn't matter what the other side says. It's not true if it comes from that source. I said it earlier, I'll write stories that are based on actual events, and I'll be told that's fake news. I'm not sure. I think it's a real crisis, and I don't know what the answer is. So that's my long answer is I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I don't know either. While we have issues of voter apathy, this is for you, Will. While we have issues of voter apathy by any metric, so be it votes, donations, et cetera, Americans are more politically engaged than ever. So this person asks, is that a good thing, or has something gone wrong in our politics, making everyone want to get their voice heard?
Well, we know that turnout tends to go up when the stakes of a contest are higher, and when the contest is quite close. And the stakes being higher can be informed by people taking very different positions. We're going to go down very different roads as a function of who's actually going to win. And that's clearly true in this presidential election. And when we see the path road to actually being able to accomplish a whole lot being, I mean, it's not wide open, but there's a lot will come of this presidential election. Yeah, is this a good news story or a bad news story that then we see people paying attention and wanting to engage? I have to believe that we should always be rooting for people to be more engaged and more attentive.
Yeah.
That the idea that well, the stakes are high and it's close and things are perilous, wouldn't it be better if we could all just go home and put politics on ignore? That's not a healthy place to be in. And so on Reset, you've been doing some coverage of this this experiment that's being played out in Australia, where you have compulsory voting. Dan, you were just in Australia. Were we thinking about should we have that as a rule that says we as Americans have to vote? They do this in Australia, and people vote by huge numbers.
Right.
And that, to my mind, has a whole lot of promise, and it's not premised on us calling upon you to fulfill your civic duty. It's a sense of a thing that one just does. And there's a little fine that you have to pay if you don't do it. And if you have some reasonable reason why you couldn't vote, you're not going to pay that fine. That, to my mind, would lead to a transformation in the level of turnout which we have. It's quite high, it is true. We have many, many different elections. People engage in politics in many different ways. And still our turnout is markedly lower in even the highest levels of turnout elections than we see in a place like Australia. There's a straightforward fix, to my mind, or move that we could make.
I don't know that we'll ever
mandatory.
get to in Australia. What is it, Dan? 90-something%? Their voter turnout, which is, wow.
It's extraordinary.
Wow.
Yep.
Adav, what would reform of the Electoral College look like?
Well, so this is a tricky one. So fixing the Electoral College, I think, should be on any reasonable list of sort of structural American reforms. That said, that one takes a constitutional amendment under almost any scenario. And we're not going to have a constitutional amendment to really reform the Electoral College anytime soon. So important to work towards that, but there's a lot of things that we can do in the meantime that don't require sort of that, that aren't on that long time frame, many of which we've talked about tonight. But I also want to just point out that much of the conversation tonight, any question about the Electoral College inherently is about presidential elections, right? That's a lot of what we talked about. But presidential elections are really, really tiny sample size. It is so hard to generalize from presidential elections to the rest of our democracy, which, dwarfs presidential elections by a factor of, just at the federal level, 1,000 to 1 in every 4-year cycle. So things like structural reforms, like ranked choice voting, I don't know what it would do in a presidential election because there's only one of those every 4 years. But in congressional elections and state legislative elections, it would be a huge difference, right? So would getting rid of gerrymandering. I don't know if everybody knows this. Congratulations, Illinois, one of the most gerrymandered states in the country. Not something to be proud of because it produces skewed and unaccountable legislators, right? Getting rid of gerrymandering would make a big difference. It has nothing to do with the presidential election. Those aren't gerrymandered, right? So it's important to talk about presidential elections when they happen. I'm very glad that they juice, interest in in democracy. As an election lawyer, I spend like 3.5 out every 4 years with people, in DC, everybody asks what you do. That's like the thing. So they ask what you do.
Oh yeah, it's like the second
that's
sentence.
what they do. And, for most of the time, I'm an election lawyer, and they, start looking over my shoulder for someone else to talk to. But right now, it's like, hey, everybody, come talk to this guy. So I'm glad that presidential elections do that. But that's not, when we're trying to assess how to make the system better, that is not necessarily the best framework. We need to fix the Electoral College and other things that are specific to presidential elections, but remember that the great majority of American democracy lies elsewhere.
Thank you, Adav, and I'm sure you're fun at parties.
In October of a quadrennial year, I'm super.
I'm huge. Can I make a plug? I want to make a
Absolutely.
plug, because we've been talking about ranked choice voting, the Electoral College, a whole host of compulsory voting. The Center for Effective Government, we have what we're calling these democracy reform primers. They figured prominently in this partnership that we did with the Sun-Times and WBEZ. They were the basis for a lot of the op-eds that were written. What these primers do is they characterize what the best scholarship has to say about the likely outcomes if we were to adopt a reform. What would follow? If we did this thing, what's our best guess about how it would change a set of outcomes that you care about? It's top of mind because we just put into production one on what's likely to follow if we got rid of the Electoral College. Stay tuned, it's coming soon. But there's a library that's being built out on our website of these kinds of reforms. And they're written in ways that tap into the very best scholarship, but are meant to be accessible, punchy, straightforward. Check them out.
Yeah. Amy, as a journalist interacting with voters and local election officials, are regular people really as politically polarized as it seems? And how do we build more mutual understanding and combat polarization?
I mean, yes and no. There are regular voters who are polarized, but they are the more politically engaged ones. I think Will talked about the more moderate middle, and I think that's exactly right. And that is where something like ranked choice voting can really make a difference. So, I mean, honestly, one of the biggest difficulties of our campaign staff in these final weeks is finding people to talk to who haven't made up their mind yet. It's remarkable to even conceive of somebody who hasn't made up their mind at this point, but they exist, and they're the ones who are going to decide this election, if it's as close as it seems like it is. And so when you go out there and talk to people in the country, it's very, very hard to find those people, and almost always it's someone who is absolutely a Harris supporter, and absolutely a Trump supporter, and never the twain shall meet. It's divided. I think there are people who wish that there was another choice, and so they sort of gravitate to the one that's the least objectionable to them, but there's a wish for something else.
Lynn, we are at the real closing now, so I want to put it back to you for final words here. And someone's picked up on our earlier conversation on Project 2025, as I was discussing with Will. He said, how likely is the GOP to achieve Project 2025, even without a second Trump presidency, especially considering MAGA influence in local and state policy spaces in the Supreme Court? Any thoughts?
I'll give you a few, and I'll do it quickly.
Yes, please. Give me the 2-minute version.
If the Democrats hold either chamber of Congress, even without calling it the 2025 agenda, some of the MAGA issues, with or without Trump, just won't pass Congress, period. Then we could get into, when we want to do this forum again tomorrow night, whether or not the Senate should consider lifting the 60-vote rule, but we'll save that if we do this again tomorrow. Again, as we peel away the onions in terms of democratization and what it means, how the Senate functions. So the short answer is this kind of thought, though, is very much spilling through our nation, not necessarily called 2025, but if you look at local school board and library board elections locally, nationally, ties in with the book banning movement and other related matters, this kind of issues are working its way from the top down and in some ways bottom up. but the issue set is very similar when you look at some of the concerns of what we're loosely calling the MAGA allied voters.
So we'll leave it there. I want to give a special thank you to our wonderful panelists for their insightful conversation tonight. Round of applause for these folks, please. And a round of applause for yourselves for coming out tonight, having you here supporting the Democracy Solutions Project and this collaboration among WBEZ, the Chicago Sun-Times, and the University of Chicago's Center for Effective Government. It's really appreciated. We have spent, as Sadia mentioned earlier, the last 17, 18 months exploring these critical issues facing our democracy and searching for solutions. So thank you as well to our project leader, Ariel Van Cleve, sitting there in the second row. This has been her baby for the last year and a half. Someone is going to sleep real good tonight. And to our UChicago partners, Sadia Sindhu and William Howell, thank you very much. Both the WBEZ and Chicago Sun-Times newsrooms, specifically our government and politics teams, the engaged journalism team, and the Sun-Times editorial team. Thank you to my crew at Reset, as well as our leadership at Chicago Public Media, Gilbert Bailon, Jen Coe, Tracy Brown, and Melissa Bell. Have a good evening, all.